All right, hello and welcome to Between the Liars with Ryan and Josh
Hello, everyone.
and Marcelo.
Hey, everyone.
It's good to have everybody back. I don't think we've had the OG squad minus Austin in, what's it been, a couple of weeks?
It's been more than a couple of weeks.
Yeah. Well, we'll just go with a couple of
You
weeks.
can say it's a couple of. It's fine. You can say it's a couple of weeks.
Couple of weeks, you know. All right, today we're going to be discussing school choice. Specifically, we're going to be bringing in Arizona House Bill 2853, which I believe it was just signed by the governor. If not, the governor is going to sign it in the next day or two, which makes Arizona the first state to have universal school choice, meaning every one of their students is eligible to use their vouchers. We'll get into more of those details in just a second here. But before we get into that, remember that you can majorly help our show by liking and subscribing, pushing them through the YouTube algorithm. Yes, those 2 likes do help push us, not to the top, but at least we're not tied for the bottom. You know? All right. Also, remember, you can follow us at Between the Liars on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And now we'll get into the overview. So under this new voucher plan, all 1.1 million students in Arizona are going to be able to enroll in public school through vouchers, but they can also use it. The amount is going to be equivalent to like $7,000. And I believe that's annually. And they can use it for a variety of educational purposes. The current voucher plan in Arizona was helping fewer than 12,000 students. So it's quite a bit of a jump there, which means that this makes every Arizona student eligible for taxpayer-supplied funds to attend private and religious schools, as well as for online education, homeschooling, tutors, and more. Now, this proposal, or I can't say exactly this proposal, a similar proposal was rejected in 2018. That was going to be called Proposition 305. Main reason that that was rejected is because it would have limited the program. Instead of just boom, snap of the fingers, every student is eligible, it would have only allowed 5,000 per year to be added. So we have to be careful with the direct comparison being made there. But a lot of the people opposed to this bill were pointing out and claiming that this is kind of overruling the will of the people. That was overwhelmingly rejected by I think it was 60 to 63%, something like that, of the voters. I think because it was a proposition, my understanding through ye old Google search was that it was like a direct vote on a special session. So, all right, I'm going to kick it to Josh and Marcelo. What are your initial thoughts on this? Anything you want to add on the context?
I don't know if this is the time to do it, but I would love to get into a discussion of the idea of school vouchers, because
Sure.
I think we can talk about the bill specifically, which, disclaimer, spoiler alert, I definitely don't agree with. I think it really goes against the idea of vouchers. I guess the idealistic point of view of most people.
Well, we have some contention, so that's good. This is going to be a good episode.
We always have some contention. We have to. It's
we do this.
Yep. And I don't really I don't know why it was rejected in 2018, but I was checking some polling, and the school choice, as it's branded, right, like the freedom of parents to choose where they put their children in, does have a majority support in Arizona. So, even if this went to a if this went in a proposal, then I think it would also pass. But I
agree.
I also think it's worth analyzing why. And again, another thing is I was checking the stats on Arizona's performance, and when it comes to the schools, and in K through 12, they're ranked in the bottom 5, bottom 10 in most studies. So they're not doing so hot, which I'm guessing that's why many people want to see some change.
It is really interesting to me, and you see this with any contentious issue, any major issue. It seems like when we're not happy with the status quo, the people will at times just write a blank check to the government and be like, just do something. And then at that point, whoever's got the more populist appeal at that point seems to be able to just kind of sway that the way that they want. People post-COVID and during COVID were not particularly happy with the education system. I feel like that was an exasperating factor that kind of really, some people weren't happy with the education curriculum. Some weren't happy with the online learning. Some weren't happy with the strikes. There's a lot going on there. Josh, your thoughts on this?
I've always found school vouchers to be a really inverse way of handling education funding. It seems like if you wanted to have a way to uh, enable people to send their children to what programs they wanted to and to handle the financing easy, you would just have students enroll in what in what capacity individual schools could handle into what they whatever their student selection process is, and get their students, and then that school sends a letter to the government at the end of the year saying this is how many students we have, and the government hands them their check, or they report it at the beginning of each semester of how many students they're going to have attending, and the government finances in that ways. This is to me, it always seems weird to have like turn to the families and go, here's the money, now go spend it, instead of just having the organizations report it and then just distribute the funding way. Because I do think if there's anything positive that can be said about any voucher program, and I'm pretty universally opposed to all of them, is that insofar that they do help get money towards schools, that's all right. But most of the time, they pull money away from already struggling school systems and deflate teacher salaries. And it just most of the time it works out to being net less money involved in the education system, from the government's perspective and from like an investment point of view. So if it can help, that's where it does help, because I think the number one problem facing our school system here is dramatically misallocated budgets, dramatically underpaid teachers and underfunded classrooms, teachers buying supplies and basic crowns and markers for their classrooms. Is just unacceptable.
So I agree with those portions, right? Like teachers are underpaid, they're undervalued, they have a lot of expenses they incur to fund their classrooms. How do you think that that's deflating? Like if I give them the vouchers, other than like the funds not going to the school, so like in theory it balances out, right? Because there's fewer students, they need fewer teachers. How is it if I use vouchers? You said that deflates their salaries. I'm curious what the evidence
I mean,
is for that.
private sector like marketplaces are typically going to drive down wages from previously government controlled industries. That's just going to be a market trend, I think, for a large part of the education system. And I think also the sometimes not diversifying, but the oversaturation of money across a whole bunch of different projects. And for the most part, it just drains money away from the public school system to jobs that don't pay as well. And because of that, it lowers the overall, you just don't see teachers' wages go up too often with these bills.
Oh, sure.
And so so I don't see this being a too competitive solution towards our education problem, when it's just apathy from our government and trying to solve a lot of the problems facing the school system. Because how we fund the school system is in my view, the significant problem of the school system, because low property taxes create low income schools, which don't have as good success rates, to which go, and it creates a cycle of poverty just through the education system's funding process. So these living district agnostic funding plans of vouchers can be positive and there to drive money into a community, but I don't see them pan out overly well in most states.
You do raise an important point there, Josh, that if you're only able to attend school where your tax dollars through property taxes, et cetera, through that specific funding, then to me, this seems like the ticket out of there, right? Like I'm too poor, let's say, to live in the rich neighborhood, to have the higher quality of education, but I can now attend that school. To me, I would think that would fix your critique there, that, the cycle of poverty can be broken now because they get to choose to leave.
Yeah, but not everybody can choose to leave, right? Like the school's still there. Like, so are you saying you have, let's say, very simplistic, or you have two school districts. One is two districts. One is poor and one is rich. And in this ideal world where all of the poor students from the poor school have the vouchers to leave, do they just build another school in the rich district and then just have two schools here? Is that and then because like
they might
That's not what happens though, because not everybody can leave, and not everybody either wants to or is able to, and like otherwise you wouldn't have all of these public schools that are still standing with whatever little money they have. And I think that if that were to be true, then, you know, obviously everyone would be like, okay, we're just gonna like tear this down and then just build this new school in the richer district, which I don't know how realistic is.
Well, to me, it seems to level the playing field, though, right? Because schools, a minute ago, without this voucher program, their admission was based off of, do you have the funds and are you in the district? And now I don't know exactly what their entrance is going to look like, but I would imagine it'd be similar to the college system, in which they're going based off of, well, what students qualify. We take the most competitive students. If the most desirable school gets all of the applications, then they weed them out. And then students will now be shuffled around rather than based off of your socioeconomic class, which you just mentioned was a problem because you can't help where you were born into. Now it's based off of merit because everybody has the same voucher system.
But not everybody can get into, like, if you're, let's say you're the nice school, right? You're like the charter school, or you're the private school. It's like, okay, we take vouchers and we're looking to take students for the top 50, right? Top 50 percentile. Not everybody who applies is going to fit in that criteria, right? If you have criteria too. So where do the other people go? Do they go back to the underfunded public school?
Well, I think it's going to depend based off the criteria who gets shuffled out. But I don't know. I would imagine that if this is making it more of a capitalistic structure, then schools will have to make themselves more desirable in some ways, and or they're going to have schools that are still underfunded. That's still going to happen. I know that that's going to be the case. But if that's something we can't fix at the moment, or we're not fixing at the moment, then I would say at least now where you go to school is not determined by where you live. It's based off of other things, which you can have a little bit more control over.
Yeah, it's just what I'm trying to get at is that you always, in this specific scenario where, like, you know, you have a competition and you make the school system a competition, it's not a win-win scenario. You have losers in this. There's somebody loses. And, you know, unlike public schools, these you know, new charter schools, private schools, whatever you want to call them, they can have standards, and they don't need to accept everyone unless, you know, maybe I missed that part in the bill. But if they don't need to accept everyone, then what you know, students with disabilities, students who are not performing as well, like underperformers, those are left to the system that is already underfunded and continues to be underfunded because those fixed costs don't go anywhere. I think it is important to highlight the fact that when you take students away from the public system, you are inevitably are taking money away, which is what Josh said, is that you're taking money away from a system that is supposed to, you know, encompass everyone. And then you start taking people away from that, then there is a loss for the public school system.
There is, and I think you highlight the fact that it's not fair. And I would say the current system also isn't fair. And I think we would all agree with that. So I think then what I would say is the benefit here is that now there are students who want to leave and are able to leave who now have the financial ability to do so, versus before this bill was passed, if they were a smart student who, let's say, would qualify for the higher, richer school, they were still limited by their socioeconomic class. Like, I think that I would have to acknowledge, of course, you're right. There's still going to be unfair things, but I think that we're still raising the bar a little bit, although it's not a perfect system.
I mean, all education data out there right now suggests that where voucher programs come, systematic inequalities in education fundamentally get worse. Because as Marcelo pointed out, and as I kind of pointed out before, it does drain away resources from the public school system. And there's people who can't get away from public school system. And we also all agreed from the outset, one of the key problems facing the public school system was a critical lack of funding. And you mentioned how they might have to compete, how they might have to find value. But how's a school system that's already struggling and then loses a whole bunch of money and then turn around and said, well, you just lost a whole bunch of money. You're already struggling beforehand. Now turn around and compete with these otherwise very well-funded institutions. Because the other thing to keep in mind is not all of these institutions are going to be equal. Is this institution going to offer a bus service? There's no guarantee a charter school does. Is this, you know, system going to cost more than just the voucher program? Is it going to be a $14,000 a year school and you get $7,000 from the voucher? Or is it just a $7,000 school and you only have to pay your voucher? These set up systematic inequalities within the education system that are explicitly based on people's social economic backgrounds of their parents and have nothing to do with the individual child. And so these systems come in and create a competitive world, but that fundamentally says, well, you weren't born into a wealthy family, so you're going to basically get disadvantaged from day one, because this is how we intentionally made the education system. There's a reason segregation has been climbing back to numbers that we saw in the 60s and 70s, slowly since the 1980s, when school vouchers started becoming more and more popular. Where school vouchers exist, school segregation, and the more likely for a school to be of very much so a singular ethnicity, also increases. These
So
are
when you
statistical side effects observable in every single voucher state.
I want to ask this question then, is when you say segregation, I feel like there's this conflation between like Jim Crow era segregation where you cannot attend this school versus I feel like now segregation is also used to describe just the general collecting where like specific groups tend to homogenize. Which are we talking
Well,
about
I
here?
mean, if we talk about a financial system of where Black families on average have 10 times less wealth than your white families, of where we look at a continued system of disenfranchisement, not only in where people live, but in what jobs they have access to and what schools they have access to. And then we introduce this even more so into, how much money do you have determines the quality of your education and where you get to go to school. Of if you don't have any extra money to pay toward your child's students, and you just go to the public school system, and when everyone else with maybe $1,000, $2,000, available goes to a nicer school system, and then your school system gets worse. And we have a system of where we know certain groups and populations are economically disadvantaged and have less resources to capital. And so then we come into a system that is supposed to be the foundation of getting your start in this world and figuring out your way when you're 5 years old. And we make it into a competition that already starts setting the parameters for someone's life because their parents didn't make enough money.
But the parameters are already set, and this was what I feel like you keep jumping between critiquing the current status quo of you said that, what was it, 10 times Black families make 10 times less. Is that what you said?
Have less wealth accumulated, so in property.
So
income.
one, I would point out that there's also you have to account for the fact that you can break that down by race. I understand that, and that's a fair statistic. That's fine. But also, there's plenty of poor white people, so it's not just broken down by race. But on top of that, what you're saying,
white people too.
But what I'm saying here is that argument that you made, the bulk of what you just said, says that you're limited by your socioeconomic class. And I think that this lets you break out of that a little bit more. And
But
I think the reason the critique to this, saying that it won't improve, doesn't account for both just the tendency that things will shift along with it. So if we see more people going towards these rich schools and more funding going towards those schools, of course they find a way to get more of the students there because we're like, we're desirable. So they very well might, even though they don't now have a charter bus system, maybe they would. Like I'm saying that the critique though only holds true, and I think it's a fair critique only if we don't account for the possibility for change. Like we have to assume.
What percent of charter schools across the nation have a bus program right now? Like there's tens of thousands of charter school systems. Like it's less than 10%. Like there's charter school systems have been running in America since the 1960s when they were first invented to segregate the schools in Arkansas. The first charter school system, the school voucher program, started in 1958, a year after the Little Rock Nine enrolled into the Little Rock public school system. The governor of Arkansas at the time closed every single public school in Little Rock and then opened up charter schools with voucher programs to resegregate the schools. And Little Rock's school system wasn't integrated until 1960, 4 years after the court's mandate. So it didn't even just end when the military had to come and integrate the Arkansas school system. So these systems are designed to do this from their historical origination. And since the 1950s, we've seen increasing growths of racial and ethnic isolation in our school system.
What was done was racist and horrific, but having done that in the past does not mean that that was the fundamental purpose now when we're doing this. In fact, I still think that I'm going to go back to what I was saying, that it allows them to escape their ties to their property and what their taxes can pay. They
haven't even updated the slogan. School choice was Governor Orwell Fabius's slogan too. It's the same slogan.
Well, and I think you're overlooking an important factor here. It allows them to use this funding towards homeschooling, religious schooling, private schooling, as well as tutoring services. So if you want to stay in your charter school and you want that $7,000 to go towards tutoring to help your child where they're at, boom, that's a bump right there. If you want to use it for homeschooling, when my parents homeschooled me, they had to pay twice because they had to pay through the tax system for me to go to public school, and then they had to pay for me to be homeschooled because I wasn't using that. So now it's allowing parents who are like, you know what, I would love to homeschool my child, I would love to give them that individualized learning, but I can't afford it. It gives them that opportunity too. So I think that if you're looking at it as a one-to-one comparison, I think your argument would hold a little bit more weight. But when we account for how broadly they allow this to be tailored, I don't know that your criticism stands there the same way that it would have.
Then why aren't the school systems becoming more ethnically diverse over time? Like, the
What?
statistics are just against you here. Like, every
How?
time, because that's just what they are. Like, if you go and observe a state and look at the ethnic diversity of a school system before and after a charter school piece of legislation came through the piece of government, they were more racially diverse school systems before a charter school system. And the longer a state continues with a charter school system, the more racially segregated the school systems become. This is true in every single state.
So I would have to actually look at where they ran that analysis and what the final results
50.
were. Well, but listen, because what I could say is, sure, okay, great. Demographically, they broke down, but there could be a million reasons for that. And you have to actually look into the specifics of that analysis. So for example, what I mentioned a second ago, it might be that people with similar values cluster together. And Black families have a very strong cultural value, and they have different values than, say, the Hispanic community. So the fact that Hispanic communities might cluster together and Blacks might cluster together doesn't automatically mean, aha, because this has followed, because that would be committing the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, meaning that because it follows, it's caused by, meaning you're trying to make the claim here that racism, et cetera, or just following the school choice, we see more segregation. That doesn't mean that it was caused by it. It might be that now that they have the choice, they're able to go where they want, and maybe they would like to affiliate themselves. Like the concept of homophily, or clustering with people who have similar values, look similar to us, is a very real social psychological phenomenon, which is why I say we have to look into the actual data and not just say because it follows school choice, we automatically have a worse
It's just
society.
really hard to believe that, like, oh, because these people share the same values, they will be together. When you look at like cities like Detroit, right? Like where they instituted charter schools a few decades ago,
Yep.
and now all of the charter schools are predominantly white, and all of the public schools are predominantly Black or Hispanic. I don't feel like it's shared values of being poor and being like lower funded schools. Like I don't.
Do you think that might be because they can't afford to go to those nicer schools then?
But I thought the voucher program would make everything equal. Is that not like?
Well, that's what I'm saying is, do you think that the voucher program would fix it? I don't know if Detroit has a voucher. I was actually asking.
No. The Detroit has a voucher. Like
it does have a voucher program.
They've had, yeah. That's what I'm saying is that the charter schools are predominantly white, and like they're very successful. Whatever you have a bunch of rich people who are sending their kids there. Yep. Private schools, they're doing fantastic. Good for them. Whatever. But you also have a bunch of schools that are being closed, that are public schools that didn't have enough funding to continue existing, and you have the ones that are left that are also in danger of closing, that have underpaid professors and et cetera, and have predominantly people of color as their as the students attending these schools. So I think this again adds to the argument that over time you see the same demographic differences popping up again and again. And like this is not something that is exclusive to one area in particular.
What does Detroit's voucher program look like? Is it a one-to-one comparison between here and Arizona? Like, is it you can go wherever you want, or do they limit which families are eligible? I don't know the answer to that.
I highly, I haven't obviously haven't read it, but I highly doubt that they would. Sorry, there's noise.
Casually causing chaos in the streets.
Yes, it's very, very back in DC, super messy, but I love it.
Keep going. I'm listening. I'm looking up the Detroit voucher system.
Like I highly doubt that the Detroit voucher system would be applied exclusively to white families. If that was the case, then I would be very surprised. I just don't think it is. Like, there's a reason why. Like, there needs to be Go ahead, John.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. It's the access to bus routes. It's the, do you come from a multi-vehicle house? Do your parents have to take your only family car into work, and both of them, like, one of them has to drop the other off, and they both go into work, and there's only one car. So if there's not a bus route available, you just can't go there at all because your family lacks logistics. For whatever reason, your family owns one car. That happens to a lot of people. And so that basically means if the school system doesn't have a bus system and you're a one family car, you don't get to go to that school system. And that
And I think
basically
that's a
turns to
valid
every
critique.
economically disadvantaged person and says, go somewhere else. And that's an incredible. And then at the same time, to pull money out of the public school system, which is the one place they can go, it's just such a slap in the face as a policy decision to defund the options remaining and then not give them the tools to fully take advantage of the new options created. That's bad policy.
Is the voucher system the only way these schools are funded? Because I think that's going to be an important question.
Well,
because
no,
if it is, then that argument bears a lot more weight.
No, I mean, tuition on top of it is a great way to disenfranchise people out of your school system that require an extra 5, 10, 6, whatever, how much money you want to charge in tuition for your private school, and charge that on top of your voucher program. And you very much, there are private high schools that charge more than a lot of universities do. Like, yes. I've heard like stories of people paying like $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a semester for high school tuition, and I'm like, I hate rich people.
It's a lot.
Like wow, like, well, this is just awful.
I don't think that this. I'm not so naive as to believe this is automatic. I'm having a hard time finding these stats, by the way, so I'm still looking. But I just to Josh's point here, I'm not so naive to think that this just automatically makes all things equal. I think what it does do is it does shift us towards an improved system. If we look at the whole system, the ecosystem of education as a whole, because it is removing a barrier. It's not all, because what you raised, Josh, as criticisms are fair criticisms when it comes to what is your socioeconomic status, the specific school. But I think that, you're not going to see, if I were to guess at how this is actually going to play out, you're not going to see the poorest and the lowest in the socioeconomic classes jump to the top tier school just by and large. I think you might see a few, maybe if they're qualified and they can afford it, and it's like fully covered, like we mentioned a second ago, maybe. But I think more realistically, you'll just see a gradual improvement. It is a better option for them. They might go, 2, 3. I don't know how you would grade these schools, but maybe they would jump up 2 or 3 scores or whatever in the schools because they're no longer stuck at this one particular school. I think it also frees up parents, because what is one thing that parents have to look at when they're looking at buying a house? They have to think, what is the school system like? What are we eligible for? And that does tie into, where are the bus routes, et cetera, like you mentioned, Josh, and that's fair. But I think that this removes that option, so people have a little bit more freedom there too.
I think Arizona is a very special example because it is the first time that a state has done a universal voucher plan for everyone, like 1.1 million students, which I think holds a lot of potential. In my opinion, potential to be destructive, but I guess we'll see. And that is different because I had been reading about this perspective, and a lot of our Hispanic parents in Arizona, again, a very diverse state, they're commenting on the idea of like, okay, this is our way out for a better education for a lot of traditionally disadvantaged minorities. And that's an argument that in this case, Arizona is like, okay, we're giving it to everyone, so it's not only a few people get it. I still think that, in the case of like choosing where to live and like where to buy your house, you're still going to choose it based on how close the schools are, right? Like, obviously, it's not going to depend specifically on the school district, but if the better schools are closer to whatever you can afford, if you can't even afford a house, then that's definitely going to impact your decision, your choice, if you may.
Here's what I have. Were you referencing the ETV programs, the education and training voucher? That's the one that I'm seeing that's popping up here, and it provides $5,000 to youth who meet specific criteria. If it is, I'll read you what those are. If it's not, I'll keep looking.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so this is youth who are or have been in an eligible foster care placement on or after their 14th birthday through the state of Michigan, youth adopted from foster care or placed in relative guardianship, and then youth that have a high school diploma or GED. This might be This is for
That
trade
sounds-
school
that's-
though. This
That
isn't
sounds
K
very
through 12.
specific. Yeah, I don't think that's what
Okay.
we're talking about,
That's
and
fine.
it's okay. I wouldn't worry about it. My general idea, my general perspective, and again, I think we should. You said that you were homeschooled. I can do my rounds and say that I went to private school. Oh no, I'm guilty as charged.
Josh
I
was
went to a
homeschooled?
private school in Peru, back home, and that is because the public school system is severely underfunded, and like you would only consider going to public school if you were maybe in like the bottom 20 to 30% of earners. Like it's really for like lower class, low class, like low income earners in the country. And that it's because the public school system has been so underfunded because everybody keeps going to the private schools. And it's like, I'm a little afraid that something like that could happen here. That, my education was fine. And, I'm very, privileged to have it, and my parents were able to pay for it. But at the same time, I just feel like opening up the doors for all of these schools definitely increases, the potential benefits for people who can afford to pay them or who can afford to, actually choose. But for those people who were already disadvantaged, for the bottom 20%, for the people who were already having problems going, like, having an actual education, this just makes things worse. Like, I think as a whole, you're leaving some people behind.
So the last thing I'd say then, since we're shifting away from that Michigan thing, is I would caution people to not draw conclusions racially, demographically, without actually having the study. I won't comment on that, but those are the things that I would need to see before I'd be like, okay, yeah, sure, that's definitely a disparity caused by that. Just to kind of throw out a point of contention to see where this discussion goes, I'm curious, would it be the worst thing in the world if everyone started going to private school, religious school, and homeschooling, if those were their preferences? And that's where we shifted based off of where the voters go with these vouchers. And then the public education dollars started going into those instead, because you just mentioned, Marcella, that those were, at least where you are and generally true in the US, they tend to have a higher standard and prep people better.
I'm going to ask, because you say like if they choose to do so, right? And like going to these schools is not free, right? So they can choose to go to public school, but they can only choose the other options if they're able to afford them, right? So how is it a choice, right? Like you say, would it be too bad if they had the choice? I would say they have the choice, they just can't afford to actually. It's the illusion of choice, right? They're not able to do it. So if they can't pay for it, then really, can you call it a choice?
Well, but what I was saying is the argument is often made, we haven't tried enough with public education, so we should fund that more before doing this. What I'm saying is, what if we took that concept of, instead of funding public government schools more, we just gave them these vouchers, but we increased that so that they could afford that. And then it seems like, from what I've understood, most people prefer, if they can afford it, private, religious, or homeschooling. Those are just the more expensive options. They just tend to have higher placements in higher education, etc. So if we started investing our government funds more into those, do you think that'd be bad?
But the problem is that you have a private entity, right? You have a business, you have a company, and then you're funneling funds from the government to the private entity, which, mind you, sounds very socialistic, but you're funding these private companies through public funds. Then what is the difference between that and a public school? Then the difference is that there's less accountability, right? Like, because you have what else is the difference?
I think the point of accountability is actually extremely important, because there's a lot of towns across rural America where there's only one school. And so if a private corporation comes in and kicks out the local, public school through its, fancy new systems, gets rid of the school board, because the school board only controls the public school. So now there's no publicly elected officials that control education for your children and your community. And you have surrendered that control over to this private corporation, because your town can only support one school, has a natural monopoly over what they want to do with your children. And that is part of, I think, one of the fundamental problems that I think conservatives just do not understand about the voucher program, is that you are surrendering democratic control of the school system over to unelected private corporations that you can hopefully maybe vote with your dollar with, not like they're going to become natural monopolies like your different ISPs you have the luxury of purchasing from, those who have the contract with the government to operate there in the first place, and only those. You lose your democratic school board if you go all private school. And to me, that's an egregious authoritarian reach over the school system. People should have the right to vote and have an influence over the education system, and it's wrong if they don't.
I partially agree with part of what you said. So one, I would say, I think this is being grossly misrepresented as, well, there's no accountability, there's no standards, etc. When first and foremost, all homeschoolers have to meet state and national standards. Like if you were
that highly depends. I can tell you a story about my background as a homeschooler, because I grew up with a significant amount of illiterate people, because in the state of Tennessee, there was no oversight. If you just registered with the right school, the only thing you had to do, and this is how I got my high school diploma, so I'm not telling you no lie. My parents, we got a piece of mail in the letter from this school, and we'd write down what books I used, and they'd write down a letter grade on it, and we'd mail that back in to the school, and that was it.
And that is a failure in execution, because
that's still policy in Tennessee right now.
But I'll give you a parallel example. No, you're not supposed to do that. Did it happen? Sure. But it's no different than these other state schools or government schools where they're choosing to just pass students along on the basis of equity, and they're graduating and they cannot read, they cannot write, they're illiterate. So a failure within the system doesn't automatically mean, when we're talking about the enforcement of it, doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. It means that that was a failure there and that shouldn't have happened. But the law in Tennessee is that you have to meet state standards. I'm sorry that didn't happen. You seem to be doing just fine.
Oh, sure. Most of my friends aren't. Most of the people I grew up with were treated just horribly. And it was systematized because there were several institutions in Tennessee that aided with this and coached people along with it and taught them how to do it.
And that's the problem.
Taught people how, and like several churches that were involved and donated to these organizations. It was a system of several thousand, tens of thousands of people spread across the Southeast dedicated to subverting and getting around state laws like this. Like, I don't have anything positive to say about homeschooling. I'm borderline agree with Germany and just say it's actually dangerous and enables far more child abuse than we can possibly ever really comprehend, because most of the children I grew up with were experiencing some type of familial neglect or abuse, whether it was their parents beating them or screaming at them or an emotional neglect or abuse. I don't know too many normal homeschoolers that came out of it. All of us have some pretty awful horror stories. Because I grew up in the far deep conservative, kids got screamed at and beat for reading Harry Potter and believing evolution was real. Like, homeschooling with complete just letting the people do what they want, letting people believe what they want. I grew up around a lot of really disconcerting families and a lot of really scary adults who just did a lot of terrible things to the children. And a lot of it was a systematic organization of helping people get around state laws and regulation to enable it. I have a lot of disconcerting belief. Homeschooling is just bad, in my opinion.
I'm sorry that was your experience. I had a very different experience, even growing up just an hour or two from you. I think that, I don't know, it fascinates me that the concept here, and you just kind of touched on this as like a minor point, but I've heard it dragged out as a major point, that homeschooling just basically shouldn't happen because it allows for neglect, abuse, etc. And it's just fascinating to me, and I strongly disagree with this notion that the government has to be involved for children to be raised well. There are, of course, instances of neglect, abuse, etc., and that's tragic. And I'm not trying to undercut your personal story here, but I think that if your personal experience there surrounding that area with the same group, we have to look at the broader picture though and say that's not pervasive. It when it happens, of course, it's tragic.
Yeah, it's just a question of where is it statistically more likely to occur, and what's the degree of statistical threat to children we're willing to have. What percentage of children harmed by a particular method of education is too much before we consider it to be problematic? And that's the line we're playing. How many young queer youth need to kill themselves at homeschooling co-ops, like that happened at both the homeschooling co-ops I went to, before we consider it to be systematic, child neglect? That's always the question we're playing of, how much more dangerous does it have to be before we're willing to condemn it? And we're always going to come to different answers about that. What's the acceptable amount of risk to expose people to?
And it seems like there is, in that same vein, a great deal of exceptions that are made for the public schools. And the argument is made, it's accessible, it needs to be there. There's plenty of people who kill themselves, who
Sure.
experience greater amounts of bullying
Is it
in the public
statistically
school
more
system.
likely?
Absolutely. In the public school system, the amounts of bullying that take place is not even comparable to
So the question
homeschooling.
though is, do homeschoolers have a higher probability of suicide attempts than public school
But what
children?
I'm saying is that I don't think that you would make the same argument that, if the idea is, I don't know, it sounds like one person killing themselves for bullying someone else is too much. We don't do that same application to government schooling.
No,
So
and
just
that's not what I said. I said, is it statistically more significant, and how much more risk is too much risk? You're
and I'm saying
completely
right now it is,
misconstruing what I'm saying.
absolutely.
I'm saying of how much is too much more. My argument is there is more, and it's more frequent and prone and probabilistic within the homeschooling community because there is no oversight and ability for there to be third-party accountability versus the public school system. I'm not saying there's a perfect system. I'm saying insofar that one system is dramatically and statistically significantly more likely to do harm than another, there's a very clear preferable ground to be taken. And
It
to me, that's
depends.
just a cut and dry weighing back.
But if you're gonna throw out statistics like that, then we would have to look at, are we looking at it like per capita? Because far more people attend
That's how
public school.
statistics work. That's
No, I'm
literally how
aware.
statistics work. Right?
I'm aware, Josh, but I'm saying that the data that you're proposing, we would need to see the significance value. We need to see the F value. We need to know what is the comparison, because right now it's not even a direct comparison. Because
the
there's
research is
far
out,
more.
like out there of like the impacts of like and like outcomes of like homeschooling. Like you see like the standout exceptional cases that homeschoolers like to talk about, but we can also just run every token critique that there is out there.
But
Of like,
when
sure,
you say statistically significant, if I survey a group of homeschoolers and I see what is the amount of abuse that's taking place, and I say I have statistically significant results, literally all that
correct.
means is that it was greater than the probability of randomness that this happened. So that doesn't mean anything in and of itself. Statistical significance means zero things by itself. You
Right,
have
but that's
to
what I'm
apply it to
saying.
something.
In a comparison of two systems, are a particular set of harms more statistically likely to occur than in another given system? And insofar that the answer is consistently harms are more likely to occur, I'm not going to prefer it. And that is, I think, one of like the fundamental driving like systems of like, why do we, and you're also like you put up another position of like the belief that the school system has to be involved is also a misnomer here, because it's an argument that if the school system is involved, it's statistically likelier to go better. So that's the compoundment we find people in. Does this policy statistically create a better world, or does it not? What produces, the most happiness and most, benefit to society? And accountability, oversight produce stable systems with good results. And
But that's not the same as
completely,
happiness
well,
and
sure. But if
fulfillment.
we're trying to create a system of where we can reliably create those things, I mean, isn't it the grandiose thing of all research to reliably predict the future? So if policies then
Yeah.
just well, right. But so policy is just research about how to organize a society. We're trying to create a probabilistically the best result out of a given outcome. Like
So then to
policies
pull
just
this out of the like theoretical, philosophical and apply it, then you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, basically because people now have the option to go to something to where they might encounter a negative situation, whether it be abuse or lower educational outcome, etc., then they shouldn't have that option.
No, I'm saying if there is a system that is statistically more likely to harm a group of people and we don't have to have it, and it's completely auxiliary and adds, nothing but a statistic net harm to society, then it just doesn't need to be. It's not that the harms may be there, or else we would have to outlaw driving. It's if we could find a better alternative to driving for mass transportation, it might be worth talking about. So insofar that we can provide better alternatives in the public school system, I'm going to prefer it.
So you do prefer, so you're saying if we could demonstrate that these are better alternatives, then
Yeah.
you would prefer them. Well, to kind of go back to what we learned from David McConnell, the states are, it's like a mini democracies, meaning we get to see this play out. None of us live in the state of Arizona, so whether it goes well or whether it goes poorly, we will watch it play out. I'll be interested to see how that plays out. Do you think then that this is going to affect educational outcomes overall in a negative or positive way? It'll affect it in some way. I
Oh
just,
yeah, they're gonna get worse.
why do you say that?
For the 20 to 30% of population who will be left in the public school system, or whatever that population ends up being, as money gets pulled out of that school system, more teachers get fired, more wages get cut, more resources get cut, the schools will get worse, and the educational outcomes of those students will get worse.
Where do you get 20 to 30%?
I'm just taking a
It's
ball
just a
line.
number that I've been throwing around. So
Okay, so let's.
Well, I mean, it might be 40 or 50% of them. Like, it's hard to, I don't know. Like, I don't know how many charter schools are going to spring up overnight. I don't know how many venture capitalists. Maybe McGraw-Hill and Pearson will open like 5,000.
There's going to be so
schools
many
down
of them.
there.
It's 1 million students getting.
So I mean, I don't know how.
$7,000.
Yeah.
It's
So I don't
gonna
know how
be
many people
insane.
are going to hop out of the school system, but the people who are left in the public school system, a good chunk of them, if not the majority of them who are still there, who don't have means to go anywhere else, are, in my opinion, I don't see any other outcome than them all having a worse public school system next year or whenever this takes effect.
So if I give you that 20 to
Maybe
30%, which I think is pretty high, let's say that it gets, and I don't even think it's going to get significantly worse for those people. I think that they will have enough options, and through these subsidies, they'll be able to improve overall. But that's still like 70 to 80% of the population who are doing better than they were a minute ago. If we're looking at the concept of like cost benefit analysis, utilitarianism, like that's a net good overall, technically. Like you said that you would be in favor of a system that improved that. I'm curious why you're opposed to it then, even with those numbers you threw out.
I think Josh has been consistent, because I feel like 8 months ago he said that if one person would have it worse, then it's overall a worse system. Like, I think in general,
Sure.
and honestly, I don't blame most people, and this might go in a little bit on the hot takes later, but like, I don't blame most people for trying to get into a voucher system, because for their kids, things will be better probably if their kids are bright and their kids are having a nice little future. And if you can take your little money away and like you're in the top 40 something percent of earners, then you will probably have a better education in whatever charter school you decide to go to. But that's not going to be the case for everyone. And there's a lot of areas in our lives that we already tend to sacrifice people in the name of benefiting the top.
Well, and another turn would be however many people do take advantage of the charter school system and have those additional resources aren't the particular people I'm too worried about with policy either. Like, if you're, I'm sorry, if you're making $70,000-$80,000 a year in America, I'm not that worried about you right now.
I would agree with you on that. I think a more tailored approach would be better.
I guess depending on like where you're living. Well, I mean, just insofar of like, sure, we might help 70 to 80% of the population go to better schools, as Marcelo pointed out. Like, can't fault people for trying to get their child into the best school they can. Just any parent's going to do that. Like, you always want the best for your child. That's just good instinct. But insofar that we just don't have to do this, and we could do something else that doesn't disadvantage 20 to 30% of the population, and we could find something that was either more equitable for everybody or just doesn't affect people who don't need, like, if you're some family making 6,000, six figure income, $250,000, $100,000 plus, you don't need extra money for the education system for the government.
I agree.
That's just wasting money. Like when it was the same thing with the COVID payments. Like, if you made too much money, you didn't get a COVID bailout. Like, the government's just like, listen, you're making bank. You don't need this. And so I think that and we've even had like the national debate around student loan debt. Like, we're not going to cancel people making six-figure income now. Mind you, there's a lot of like medical professionals who need that.
Well, you know that because Biden's trailing and the majority of his population is upper class, he was throwing around the numbers of upwards of 70 to 150,000, like, would be canceling student loan. I'm like, they don't really.
I can see if it was like your joint income, like, because if
you're it was like,
well, yeah, but I'm saying, like, if you were two like degreed professionals and you had $150,000 debt between the two, income between the two of you after going through college, and you had a good chunk of debt, I could see that happening.
I've taken us off course. Sorry, go back to the education.
So we just don't have to pass a policy that pulls money out of the public. There are 1,001 ways to better reconsider how we do funding for the public school system, whether you operate on a state sales tax or state income tax. Just bump it up 0.5%, get rid of the state taxes, and call it a day, and then fund the education through that, or get rid of the local regionality of estate taxes and just say there's a statewide fund for schools. Everyone pays estate taxes into, the government, finances back out to the state public schools to make sure everything's taken care of. Like, there are so many different ways to provide equitable and better funding towards the education system and provide better results without having to pull more money out of and more resources away from the public school system. You just don't have to hurt the public school system to do good in the education system.
Final thoughts and critiques as to how, well, let's say that you got to make a critique to how this legislation was passed, and it's going to pass. What would you do? For me, I would say I think that, like Josh was just hitting on, I actually agree with this point. It should be a little bit more tailored, right? Because if you have the money to begin with, maybe some kind of a break somewhere would be nice, but I don't think you need the exact same treatment. So I think a little bit more tailored based off of how much you're making. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but I think that would be a better way to do this voucher system instead of just all of it. At the same time, though, that is counterbalanced in my mind as far as, these are our taxpayer dollars, so I should be able to put those to my child's education anyway. But what do you guys think as we get ready to head into hot takes?
I'll half-heartedly agree with the idea of, like, yes, if it was more tailored, like I've read the Bibles of the school vouchers. They're like praising how it creates equality and how it's meant to be for people with learning disabilities, people that have traditional disadvantage. I'm like, sure, in an ideal world, those people. No, I take it back. In an ideal world, those people wouldn't even need to go to another place. They would just get education that they deserve in the public system. So, like, even in the most charitable position that I could give this system, I would just, why not just make the public school system better? Like, that's and obviously we already talked about so long about why, whatever. That's my take. And it's like, why not just do that instead?
Josh, final thoughts.
Everything is already a capitalist enterprise. You don't need to make education more of one. Please, thanks.
All right. Well, remember, you're listening to the Central Hub for Political Discourse. We'll be right back with our hot takes. We need a ticker of how many times it's been since I hit the little sad trombone, the wrong button. It's been 9 episodes since Ryan hit the wrong button. Okay. Josh, why don't you actually, you know what, Josh, you get the rebuttal on rebuttal. So we're going to let Marcelo do this one. Marcelo, why don't you tell them about our memberships that we have if they want to join us before and after the show? Now that we're like trying to get back in a groove of things.
Yeah, now that we're back in an official season 2, it's really hot in this apartment, and it's the summer. You are welcome to join our Discord behind the scenes content. Please, and thank you so much to our supporters. And there's links in the description below.
Yep. And as always, remember, you can follow us. We would love to see our follower count go up. So hit subscribe, hit the notifications for our YouTube channel. And we would love to have you follow us Twitter, Instagram, technically TikTok, although that's had been a lot popping on there for a while, but just @Between the Liars should bring you right to it. And we're going to head right back, and Josh is going to kick us off with his hot takes.
All right. I would say, to start us off, school choice and voucher programs have a bad and nasty origin to create a specific type of education system. And whether or not they intentionally are doing that by now is a great mystery. It's hard to tell. But what we do know is that schools are becoming less ethnically diverse as time goes on. But what's curious is that our public schools, they aren't. Our public school systems, all the same time, have become more and more diverse. How is that possible then if the national trend is that schools are becoming less ethnically diverse? If that is only then that the private schools are becoming so ethnically homogenous, so ethnically the same, that they're able to statistically overpower the diversity of the public school system. That is how bad racial segregation in charter schools is. They do it through bus route and lack of access to bus routes. They do it through lack of disability services and different accommodations. They do it through additional tuition charges, additional lunch charges. all types of different income requirements they may have of the parents. These schools are handed off to private corporations who make decisions not oriented on the community, but oriented on how to make their investors more money, because they're private, for-profit institutions, and they don't care about serving the community. And these private companies that come in, they take all the power away from the public school system. And then your local school board is not in charge. Your elected official has become a joke to the wishes of a couple billionaires on the coasts investing in your rural town, telling your child what to learn and when to learn it. And you no longer have a say. But congratulations, you get to pick what school to go to. Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates' school. Thumbs up, America. You done good on this one. Capitalist involvement in school systems is bad, writ large, period. I'll sign off.
All right. So my first hot take is going to be, we need to break down what is the performance of those schools. And we need to actually look at, if people happen to be more segregated in their schools, but they're getting higher educational experiences across the board, and that's not unique to specific demographics, then I would say that diversity in and of itself is not inherently a good thing. We do love diversity. Diversity is good, but it can't be the only variable you look at if you're going to talk about statistical analysis, because of course you can break things down based off of racial demographics. Really, this is more of a class breakdown than it is racial. And historically, Josh is absolutely correct. It has racist origins. That's fine. We need to look at what's going on today. We need to update those arguments and actually look at what is going on now. And personally, having looked at what's going on and what's being proposed, I truly believe that overall, the educational system is going to be improved for each of the students in this situation. They're not all going to be equally. They're not all going to come out equally, because that would be equity. And we're more interested in equal opportunity, because Marcelo hit this on the head earlier. Not everyone is interested in going to the top performing schools. And if the barrier that, Josh's most prevailing barrier has been financial, it's been you are tied based on the taxes you paid. And I say this is addressing that issue. And once we've addressed this issue, we can look at those other things. And I do think that the capitalistic structure will in fact drive these schools to try to outperform each other. And honestly, who wins in that situation? It's going to be the consumer. It's going to be the people who are voting with these vouchers where they want to go and what they want to support. And naturally, what's going to happen is the schools that are doing the things that in general the people like, they're going to get more students, they're going to get more funding, and the cycle continues. And of course, you can look at the people who are in the bottom of that. But just like in America, the poorest of the poor, the people who are living below the poverty level, are still well above the rest of the world when it comes to truly comparing to impoverished nations. So we really need to look at this on a case-by-case basis. My second hot take is going to be that a more tailored approach is going to be better. Ultimately, that's what this does. And this is going to be my last hot take. It's allowing the parents to vote what is best for their child. Why do we have individualized education or individualized learning plans for students? It's so that within the public education system, the students who don't necessarily fall to the same average as everybody else get the help that they need. And in many instances, homeschooling is an answer to that. And this allows parents who would prefer to homeschool their students, it allows them to have some money to go towards that. What we need to remember is that taxpayer funded means it's your money that the government took from you through taxes and giving it back to you so that you can put that into your education. That is a good use of taxes. And Josh took us down this dystopian route, talking about how there's no accountability. I would say right now we're already living that. It is a non-unique issue that's brought up here because we already have very limited accountability. Sure, you have people who are on the board, but we're just changing the way that looks. It's not no accountability. I would say that it might shift a little bit, but there's still going to be accountability. There's still going to be standards. And I would say that it's a little bit alarmist to say that we're suddenly going to have no standards whatsoever. We really need to think of this for what it is. Students are getting the money to put them where they would like to go.
As someone who gets accused sometimes of throwing the baby out with the bathwater on a lot of the systems that I feel we live in right now, but are not exactly adequate, I think it is a little ironic that we find ourselves in a situation where we're willing to throw away the whole system because we don't think it works well enough. I'll say that a hot take, right? Diversity is actually something that we should strive for. And the fact that these charter schools are not, are segregated, they are predominantly white in many of these cases, shows that they are not as equal as the proponents would like you to think. This is an issue that is not going to harm, like Josh says, it's not going to harm the top 10%. It's not going to harm maybe even the top 50%, but it's going to harm some people. And what I'll say again is that I cannot blame anyone for trying to have a better future for those children, right? Like that's just, if you can send your kid to private school, you do it. If you can give them a tutor, you do it. If you can put them in a better position to succeed later in life, you do it, because that's just the way things are. But at the same time, you don't think about those people, because those people will be okay. Like, you will be fine if you go to public school. You will be all right. You have to think about the people who have no choice, people who will not, just circumstances will not allow them to transfer, just to simply, like, you go to another school 5 miles away, go to somewhere else. You have people inevitably here that will be harmed by the system. And I don't think it exactly solves it for them. Years down the line, when we see what happens with Arizona and with these policies, that we'll probably see that a lot of these people who get, quote unquote, their hard-earned money back from their taxes, and they can send their children everywhere they want, many of them will be like, yeah, this was the right choice. Like, my kid is now in an Ivy League, and my kid is now doing so well. And like, nobody is going to actually talk to those people who did not get a choice, did not feel the change. And then actually they felt their classes shrunk, they felt their teachers got fired, that their schools closed, and nothing meaningfully changed for them in a positive way, but actually in the negative.
All right, comment below. What are your thoughts? We'd love to hear from you, and tell us what topics you'd like us to address next. Remember, you can find us on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Twitch, and Google Podcasts. Go ahead and give us a follow on the social media so we'll let you know when we finally decide on the day of the week that we're going to be recording. And if you enjoy this show, we would appreciate a 5-star review so we can beat that algorithm. Give us a share with your friends. I'm sure you find yourself somewhere between the liars. Goodbye for now.